The Black Plague is one of history's greatest catastrophes. A third of Europe wiped out in just 4 years. Everyone knows what the Black Plague was, but there's a lesser-known story worth telling. What happened to the survivors? In this episode, Sean Buckley breaks down the plague through a socioeconomic lens, showing how the sudden collapse of Europe's workforce shattered a feudal order that had stood for centuries and lit the fuse for the Renaissance, individual rights, and the rise of the modern middle class. We explore how catastrophe became catalyst and why its lessons on labor and power remain relevant today. Thank you for listening to the Exchange Room podcast, and I now present to you our discussion. Welcome, Sean, to the podcast. Today, I'm excited to talk with you about the Black Plague.
Happy to be here, Teddy.
What was life like before the plague hit for regular people in medieval Europe?
So, by and large, as far as we can tell, it's just a lot of base level agriculture, heavily church controlled societies. At this point, the Catholic Church is probably at its apex in Western Europe in terms of just geopolitical strength and the way it just strangulates every other power facet in society. So it's interesting because they do allow some kind of technological advancement, but it's a very limited amount that they have direct oversight into and kind of manage the growth and progress of society. So what we see the most of is just manors and farms and large amounts of what we've called serfs working the lands for a very small select group of the nobles and their chosen retinue of professional soldiers, being like the proto-knights, guys who basically go out and strong arm the local communities on horseback and with armor. And 4 or 5 of those guys can run over a town of a couple hundred people who are just half the size, underfed and unarmored and untrained. And so it was very easy to control a population like that, with just very minimal resources and little in the way of constructs, fortifications, and sociological protections.
Feudalism, which is broadly that hierarchy that exists. You have those peasants, and then you have the nobles, you have the knights defending and fighting, and you have the king and the church reinforcing that structure. Is that accurate to say?
Absolutely. So it's just an easy way to control a population, right? First, you disarm them. You make owning weapons, training with weapons, training in combat of any kind illegal for anybody but yourself, your progeny, and a select group of friends. Feudalism is ultimately just a construct that focuses on funneling the most amount of wealth into the smallest group of people possible. And that would be like a really austere form of tyrannical government backed by what is essentially the papacy and the papal authority and, divine right from God. So the Pope would designate certain rulers of areas, ordain divine right to rule over this territory. So now they can't be questioned. And then they can just do whatever they want to the local communities. How it starts is just a natural evolution in government and just a continuing funneling of wealth into a smaller and smaller group of people.
And it sounds like once it did start, it reinforced itself.
Totally, man. And you're talking about a population that was also by and large barred from formal education, right? So the only people entering the church at this point are like 3rd and 4th and 5th sons of lords. So, the church itself becomes just this backing structure to the material wealth and just the military might of the local lords. So he sends his excess children that only he can afford off to be, educated and trained scribes or scriveners or bishops, once they get to positions of power and they become archbishops or the Pope himself, if you're like a Medici type guy. It's a hyper-conservative system of government. It oversaw a slow, consistent, steady growth of population in Western Europe for centuries. But it's also like the strength of the church at that point in time. It's almost singular power was what created what we call the Dark Ages. If we look back at history, and we've referred to it as just like a time of very little change, of very little growth, compared to before and after. And from there, it was just a really slow growth back into some kind of form of stability and a population level that would be at least in the ballpark of what it was pre-Roman collapse. And it took half a millennium to get there. So feudalism is itself just like a trauma response on a societal level.
In the mid 14th century, the Black Plague rips through Europe. And so you had this incredible shift in everything about the way society was.
Totally.
And so, what was life like during that time period?
When city management goes bad and goes to pot, diseases crop up. Wastewater becomes a breeding ground for plagues, diseases, and it just so happened that it came from China at that point in time. A lot of people in mismanaged cities, and it starts there and it spreads off the Silk Road, obviously going west, but it goes in fits and spurts there, right? Because it's mostly just massive city-state structures dotting the landscape, most of which the Mongols have destroyed already on their way westward. So it does travel in the caravans of the Mongols into the Ilkhanate, into the Golden Horde, and then south into like into what would be considered Egypt. But mostly it spreads by boat. And this is the really interesting thing, is that it reaches Europe in two ways, one by land and one by boat. And the irony is that the one by land ends up by boat anyways. One of the biggest places is the Crimean Peninsula, right? And this town Feodosia, which was a major hub for slave trade. And so the slave trade is being facilitated for now 4 centuries at the point of the Black Plague. And it's one of the jewels of that part of the world. It's a major hub. Crimean Peninsula is like the place to be in the Black Sea. It's a nexus of, the steppes, Central Asia, and Europe. Massively important trading hub. And the Ilkhanate, in their final push westward, are besieging it. And this is where that myth of like, the Mongols were throwing, plague corpses via catapult over the walls of the city. That is where that comes from. It could be a myth. It could not be. It's entirely plausible. They've done worse. But ultimately, the Genoese merchants and the Jewish merchants, they flee rapidly in droves from the city and they head back into the Mediterranean and into the ports of Italy. And from there, the plague just explodes. And it's ravaging everybody it touches. But only Europe has the kind of dense populations, as you mentioned, where it just feasts, right? Because the city-states of the South or the Arabian Peninsula and of Central Asia are so far and few between, and they're so isolated and locked in. And the Mongols have spent the last, century pretty much emptying out all of Asia of people. And so by the time they get to Europe, it's like the last remaining large group of people that live in these kind of cloistered towns, villages, and cities that are all just a very integrated network. So we see almost instant societal collapse. And I mean, every aspect of society, right? Like, there's no more farmers. There's no more doctors of any kind. There's no more artisans. Half the church or more, most of the church dies. They're all large part of the kind of medical field at that point, and they're not equipped and educated and trained for this. Nobody is. So this is like the whole, the Italians with their little plague doctors with the nose full of herbs and spices. The idea is that smelling nice things means you don't smell plague, and the bad smell is what gets you sick. Wrong idea, right solution, and that like the smoke is what's killing the transmission, and like the heavy clothing, it's what's disallowing fleas from getting on the people and biting them and transmitting the disease. But what we do see is just pretty much a dissolving of every single tenet of society that Western Europe understands. And it happens almost instantly. So you're looking at a society that's been almost completely stagnant and stable for 600 or 700 years, overnight collapsing. It's the end of the world as far as Europe can tell. And it happens for years. And so there's a lot of just loss of faith in everything. And principally the church. It's is this God's punishment? Is God powerless? Why are you not helping? I pray and, nothing works. So it leads to this rise of what we understand today to be the concept of skepticism. It's a cynicism that was not allowed to foment under the auspices of the church. So now you have a population that doesn't trust anybody or anything and is becoming rapidly more independent in their thoughts and their actions and their legal systems. And so it kind of lays the groundwork for a lot of civil unrest in the following years and decades between both economic levers of power, theological levers of power in the church. I guess you'd call it spiritual levers of power. And then also intellectual levers of power. So now knowledge is shared not exclusively through church avenues. Knowledge is now transferred through the learnings that are brought from the East or the Central Asian region. So the libraries of Byzantium are now flowing into Europe. The knowledge of North Africa and the centuries of Roman and Greek scripture. So now all of a sudden you have these different ideals, different ideas, technologies, practices, beliefs, learnings spreading through Europe without the church, sitting there with a pair of scissors or a rubber stamp going, yes, no, yes, no. So now people are accessing basically uncensored data. It would be the equivalent of like the internet in its early days, where it's considered the Wild West online. And there was no corporate involvement. There was very little oversight. There was no government, restrictions. So the greatest things happen there, the worst things happen there. The same thing happens here. It just opens up the gate for possibility, chaos.
What did the church do in response to that, or if they could do anything at all?
The first thing they do is assert control as quickly and as strongly as possible. They clamp down, they issue curfews, they issue restrictions, they issue, purge edicts, they issue pogroms, they find scapegoats, whether it's the Romani or Jewish communities all over Europe. And I mean all over Europe, pogroms happened everywhere. You got hundreds of thousands of people getting killed or kicked out while the plague is happening, and then in the years afterwards. And you'll see that the Jewish population in this point in time moves east and south out of Europe. And that has ramifications in the centuries to come. And then the response of the church is, in the past, like, call out the mercenaries, lock down the town, kill as many people as possible, as quickly as possible, strike fear of God into the hearts of the peasants, and bring them back in line. They're realizing, oh crap, we can't kill anybody. We can't afford to lose any more people. They're harder to find. And they're less likely to report each other and hold each other accountable in the eyes of the Lord or in the eyes of the church, because they're also all feeling that way. So rebellions crop up all over the place. I know at the beginning, maybe before we started recording, we mentioned the Watts Rebellion. It happens in London, or at least southern England, and it's under King Richard II's rule. And it's this guy, Tyler Watts, and a couple of his friends. They go through a peasants' rebellion. It's essentially, hey, you can't treat us like this. We demand better wages. There's only so many of us, and now you're making us work for less, but we're doing 3 times as much because there's so few people left. We need more rights. I need to be able to own my own land. I need to be able to be paid adequate wages or a salary or something for what the labor I'm putting in is worth. And I just want more rights and freedoms. You can't treat me like this because there's like 3 of you left and there's like 40 of us. Yeah. And you're also sick. And so, he gets betrayed a couple times. They get screwed over by the king. Treaties are made, treaties are burned. Treaties are made, treaties are burned. They all die. Even after they come to an agreement, then they get backstabbed by the king because he's just a petty jackass. But what the population learns is that they can stand up for themselves. Basically, for the next 50 to 100 years after the plague, you have the people asserting power for the first time in maybe a millennium in a way that like the existing power structure cannot rectify and cannot clamp down on. They just can't afford to lose any more people. And if they push too hard, then there's no coming back.
how did that struggle eventually resolve?
Yeah. So we have things like the peasant statute, which is the leadership saying, okay, as a compromise, we'll let you work for wages for the first time ever, instead of just for the glory of God and the glory of your king. And then we'll feed you whatever the hell we feel like feeding you. Now we give you wages, but we're going to cap them here. And I think that's like 1371 or 76. And again, the people are like, absolutely the F not. You can't, I'm going to work for what I'm worth. Like, I will be paid what market rate says my labor and my production is worth. And this is also coinciding with a rapid explosion in technology and agricultural advancements, different techniques. You got different types of crop irrigation.
Do you think that technology was a result of this? Because if peasants now cost more at a cap, but they still cost more, now there's incentive to find a cheaper, better, more efficient way to take care of the land.
So we see this rapid growth of technology that I mentioned earlier, where it's like all these new ideas, all these new thoughts coming in from the East, both as just a natural byproduct of travel and of trade opening up from that region, and also just as a necessity. It's like they have to find alternatives. So new irrigation styles, new transportation methods, road construction, better infrastructure. So people are remembering, oh yeah, the Romans maybe had some ideas there with using the aqueducts. They try and refit or retrofit or fix these aqueducts, this Roman infrastructure, and just sewage systems in the cities, because they're realizing, disease is rapidly spreading. It's impossible to stop with our knowledge. And the only way to not deal with it is to try and prevent it. And so it leads to this rapid modernization of thought and of freedom of thought. And it's a pretty pivotal moment in Western society's history. The Renaissance is probably like a century after the Black Plague. The Renaissance technically begins in 1300, right? Like, this is when the church is opening up doors to what we call secular artists, just skilled artisans from very wealthy cities like Milan, like Rome, like Venice, like Genoa, when they're at the peak of their kind of Mediterranean trade, and they're being sponsored by patricians like the Medicis, paying for these artisans to have, great productions made, art, music, sculptures, and a kind of a return to Roman classicism, because now, oh yeah, this trade from the East is bringing this old Greco-Roman scripture and thought and these texts from Alexandria, from Baghdad, from Byzantium. So now they're learning all this, and the church is already overwhelmed processing, like, what do we censor, what do we not, what do we censor, what do we not. It's this constant back and forth. So when 50 years after this outset, the Black Plague happens, Renaissance is considered a rebirth. It's this symbolic era of kind of like this renewal of the human spirit, of European power after a long period of darkness and slumber. And so we see just everything exploding in a big way. The population booms. And then, like 100 years after the Black Plague, we're talking it's 2x what it was in Europe before the Black Plague. We have just re-entered Roman era of prosperity, stability, knowledge, and population.
The Renaissance was very gradually underway, and it was the Black Plague that gave it fuel to the fire to make it really what it was to be.
Absolutely. That's what the Black Plague does. It just lights this fire. And once it's going, there's no putting it out. So everything that was before is just gone. And now the world and society are completely different from what they were prior to this event.
When we look at Europe over the following centuries, there's a clear difference between Western Europe and Eastern Europe in the way
Yeah,
that they developed. And so if you go back to where the plague happened, now there's still differences in Eastern and Western Europe during the 14th century. But when the plague happens, you see a freeing of the peasants in the West that you don't see in the East. So I'm
Mm.
wondering, why did that not happen in the East as well?
Yeah. It's an interesting line of thought, right? Because you'd think if it works here, it should work everywhere. The same result, the same amount of death, the same consequences should lead to the same result. But unfortunately, or fortunately, if you're one of the few princes or princelings in the steppes, uh, it didn't change much in most of like what was formerly Mongol held lands. So you have these city states that the Mongols have already by and large destroyed in the century and a half leading up to the Black Plague. So when we talk about 25% of the population dies under the first 50 or 60 years of Mongol expansion, they weren't everywhere, right? They were just Central Europe or Central Asia, excuse me. So that 25% of the world population is like 80% of Central Asia. So there's just not that many people left, as we talked about earlier. And the ones that are already in these cities, and there's just not that many cities. So it's like if you're in Moscow or whatever it's called in 1360 or 1356, and everybody's getting sick, you're like, oh, well, I'll just run over to the next city and I can live in a house there and I can make pottery there and continue my living. That next city, my guy, is like 2 months walk away. You're going to die before you get there. There's no way you can get to that next place. In Europe, that next town or that next village or that next city is like a 6-hour walk on a dirt road. It's just a denser, more populated place by square mile at that point in time. The serfs have nowhere else to go. They have nowhere else to congregate because it's just like this one city in 600 square miles of land. Or you can go to the other kingdom and it's one city whose ruler is a cousin of this guy who rules your city. So why would like the 6 cousins betray each other? There's just not that much opportunity for people to gather outside of those known existing power structures. The manor lords in the East won. And you don't even see the dissolution of serfdom until like World War I or II. That is what essentially the Russian Revolution is about, is just like they just had their moment 550 or 600 years after everybody else in Europe did, because they didn't have the opportunities to gather outside those existing power structures. They couldn't go to another town that already had an infrastructure and restart there. They couldn't easily trade ideas by sneaking out and going to the next city 6 hours away. They couldn't fortify themselves informally in like an abandoned town and then form their own polity and their own system of legal governance. There just weren't places to do that. And so, unfortunately for those guys, they continue to exist as pre-Black Plague serfs for like another 600 something years.
Until we get to World War One.
Where the rise of technology and the rise of improvements in transportation increased so rapidly that now they're confronted with the fact that they can go from Moscow to St. Petersburg on train in a couple hours or a day instead of taking 3 weeks by carriage or horseback, which nobody could afford in Russia, except for the very wealthy. So all of a sudden, the advent of transportation technology enables this exchange of thoughts, of ideas, of opportunities. And that's what leads to the revolution. It was always wanting to happen. It just never had the legs. In Western Europe, we were fortunate enough in that the lesson we took from something like the Black Plague is life is not expendable. And, when you only have so many people, you've got to make changes. You've got to give people rights, opportunities, freedoms to be themselves. And that can lead to a huge jump in quality of life. But this would probably lead into an interesting thing you mentioned to me earlier, which is you call it the Malthusian trap.
The Malthusian trap, where there is very slow innovation and a large population. And when innovation does happen, you might see some tangible increase in quality of life, but that innovation, which caused more food to be developed, eventually the population catches up and grows to meet that new level of production. And then you're back to where you were, the same amount of production and food per person. And so you're stuck in that cycle, in that trap, because there is no big enough change possible because the church didn't allow innovation to happen in that large, sudden way. So there was 600 years of just nothing happening until finally a shock came, which was the Black Plague, that allowed the production per person to suddenly change, not because of an innovation, but because of the death of the people. And that opened the floodgates for everything that was to come in the next centuries.
That's a good point, man. And I think we can look at another inflection point in the 20th century that would be an example of a huge jump, right? In World War One, between the Spanish flu, the influenza, it killed like 30 million people worldwide, or even more, right? Like 50 million. It killed more people than World War One did, and it happened at the exact same time. And the people it killed were young, healthy adults. It's like 15 to like 40-year-olds. So a large part of the Western world's working force dies at the exact same time. Another large portion dies in like the largest war ever. But that leads to this moment where we're already kind of at this massive technological shift with rail propagating everywhere in the world. We're putting rail all over Russia, all over Central Europe, all over America. America is now like the rail center of the world. We got planes for the first time by World War One. We got them dropping grenades and bombs on people like four years after we invent flight. We're like, how many people can we possibly kill with this invention? Sick. And it's these big moments where these mass die-offs happen that like what happens afterwards, right? The people who come back from World War One, there's a boom. There's a huge boom. Population booms. Everybody's got great paying jobs. Society's never looked better. It's amazing. Everything's perfect. It's the roaring 20s. And then, right? And then because the Malthusian trap catches up. Another great example, like after the struggles and the privations and the depredations of the Great Depression, we launch into World War II. And then after World War II, with all those people dead, the jobs are paying super well. Everybody's having 5 kids, 6 kids. It's booming, it's booming, it's boomers. 20 years after that, 30 years after that, we're having an economic slump like we'd never seen in the 70s again. So it's just like we just go through this kind of sociological breath cycle. Inhale, exhale. And the Black Plague would be just like the world's largest inhale, followed by Western civilization's largest exhale.
Do we see a similar pattern today with increases or decreases in population or availability of population and bargaining power?
I absolutely do. So, the same way the Black Plague was instrumental in enabling the average person to assert their own wealth onto the economy, onto their local economy, and onto their lords, and demands, fair treatment, fair compensation for their labor and their time, which created that middle class. We're currently experiencing almost a direct inverse of that, right? Where you see we've had a special privilege of being an educated class amongst the global world. And so we were the ones who had the computers and the technology and access to that educational material that only we could get. If you could speak English and you lived in America, you're going to work for IBM. Ain't nobody else working for IBM, right? All of a sudden, places like India are like, we're going to learn English like our lives depend on it, because they do. We're going to do nothing but study code and programming. And now there's 500 million people that have done nothing but that for 2, 3, 4 generations. And they're saying, well, we were getting paid $2 a day. You're getting paid $250 a day. We can work from home for $50 a day, or we could come over there and work for $100 a day. How's that sound? And so the people in control, the guys who run the government, the government and the people who are paying them, the lobbyists for these big firms, your IBMs, your Metas, your Googles, they're like, it sounds like savings to me. And so now we're seeing a refocusing of the wealth into a more select group than has ever been seen in human history before. So when you talk about, aggregation of wealth, dragon's hoard type thing, we got like 10 guys on the planet who own as much as the next poorest 7 billion. And that's just like incomprehensible to really think about that. So anytime you have an excess of labor, you can afford to pay them less because there's more competition from the bottom. When you have a dearth of labor force, you have to pay them more because they can pick and choose. Well, I don't feel like working for you. I'm going to work for that guy because he's going to pay me 3x. You have that in times after major cataclysms, like after the Black Plague, after World War I, after World War II. Our population globally is probably close to 10 billion right now. It's never been higher. After World War II, I don't even think it was 3 billion. And most of that growth, almost none of that population growth was in Western society, right? So now you're talking about a country like Nigeria that has like 200 million people now. That is like a 20x in like 80 years. Could you imagine if England went from 15 million people in 1945 to 190 million people or 250 million people? What would England look like? It's hard to manage. So where all the people go? They go other places that haven't had those population booms or have already had those population booms. And what does that mean for labor as a global force? Is that it's just they can afford to pay people less.
The final question I asked everyone, you can answer it related to the discussion we had or entirely on something else. But what is something important that you've learned through your unique life experiences that you think everyone should know?
I guess I've recently taken this job where I do sales and I door to door knock. It's all right. It's good money. It's good fun. I enjoy it. Some people really hate you for it. Some people are just happy to have somebody to talk to. I think it's really important to build connections and build familiarity with humans as a whole because we're all just one collective species. Just talk to people as much as possible, whenever possible. I have a bad habit of talking too much. I should listen more.
I'm here to listen. I'm glad that I was able to listen.
I appreciate you, Teddy. Thank you so much for having me on, man.